They stepped off the rattling freight cars, sure they were walking into a punishment yard. Hungarian prisoners of war who had crossed an ocean in chains, their uniforms threadbare, their pride brittle as glass, braced for the cruelty they had been promised. The title you clicked is no exaggeration. They expected torture. Instead, a pair of cowboys waved them toward a shade tree beside a white clapboard house and offered glass bottles sweating with ice. "Coca Cola," the cowboy said with a grin you could hear in his voice. The world tilted. For a long breath, no one moved. The men had been taught that Americans were brutes who smiled only to sharpen the knife. A drink in the heat felt like a trap, but the bottles were chilled and real. Condensation beaded and slid. A corporal named Lajos reached first. He pressed the glass to his cheek, startled by the cold, then took the smallest sip a man can take and still call it drinking. The fizz stung. Sweetness burst across his tongue. He blinked as if a firework had gone off behind his eyes. Around him, the others stared with the terror of men who think the floor is a lie. More bottles came down the line. Some accepted with shaking hands. Some refused, and then, after watching the first men fail to die, accepted. The cowboys did not shout. They did not wave rifles. One of them tipped his hat and said welcome like it was the only word he knew in their language. He pointed toward the house, toward a long table set in the yard, with tin plates and loaves of bread and bowls of potatoes dusted with salt and flecked with parsley. A woman in an apron stepped from the kitchen door with a tray of coffee, and the prisoners flinched as if a hand had been raised. She only nodded and poured, steady as a spring. The hunger hit then, a hunger they had learned to sit on like a lid. It rose up and shook them. You could feel the idea of America bending inside their heads. Back in the camps across the sea, they had been shown drawings of a place where prisoners were stripped and starved. They had heard stories of forced labor until bones poked like nails through the skin. They had promised one another they would not beg. Yet here they were, under a Texas sun so bright it made the air quake, eating stew rich with beef and onion, washing it down with a soda that tasted like a festival in a bottle. This was not kindness they understood. It felt reckless, almost insulting, as if the captors were so confident they could afford to be soft. After the meal, the cowboys passed around battered felt hats, old and sweat-stained. One landed by Lajos's boots. He hesitated. To put it on would be to wear the symbol of the men who had defeated him. But the sun was a hammer, and the gesture was so casual it disarmed him. He lifted the hat, turned it once like a relic, and settled it on his head. Laughter rippled among the ranch hands, not sharp, not cruel, the sound of men who had seen greenhorns every spring. The prisoners smiled without meaning to. They had expected a camp of barbed wire and barking orders. Instead, they were shown fences that needed mending, cattle that needed moving, tools that needed hands. Work, not torment. The guards who rode along the fence line kept their rifles slung and their voices low. A cowboy named Walt showed them how to hold a rope without burning the palms. He tapped Lajos's wrist, moved his fingers just so, then stepped back and let him try. The steer did not care about war or honor. It cared about direction and calm. By afternoon, Lajos discovered that he could touch the animal with his voice alone. The shock was not only kindness, it was scale. Everywhere they looked, there was more. More horses in the corrals than a cavalry unit could mount. More sacks of feed than they had seen at any garrison storehouse. More bread cooling on window sills than they had eaten in a week at sea. Even waste was plentiful, a half-eaten heel tossed to the chickens. Coffee poured out and drained in the dust because it had gone cold. to men who had learned to chew each mouthful until it vanished, such excess was a kind of sorcery. Before they slept that first night, a projector was set up against the barn. The sheet snapped in the breeze. The film was a western, of course. Cowboys on the move, dust boiling, a river flashing like a blade. The prisoners watched in a hush so thick you could hear the reel tick. Walt leaned against a fence post and chewed a sliver of straw, glancing from the screen to the men who had been his enemies that morning and were now simply tired workers watching a story older than any border. Lajos did not understand the words, but he understood the shape of the tale. Men against land, men against themselves, men learning a way of life that did not require an emperor to bless it. They slept in barracks that smelled of pine and soap. A farmhouse lamp burned late while someone inside mended shirts at the table. The prisoners lay awake and listened to crickets and the far-off clatter of hooves. In the dark, the old truths trembled. Torture had not come. Something more difficult had arrived, the kind of mercy that does not beg for thanks, the kind of power that does not need to shout its name. Morning broke, and the bell on the porch rang bright. The men stood uncertain, waiting for the first blow that would prove reality had returned. It did not. Breakfast was eggs piled high and fried potatoes and biscuits whose steam made the skin of the face feel cool. Coffee thick enough to stand a spoon in. They ate and looked at one another with the helpless grin of starving men dressing wounds with butter. Out on the range, the day began to teach. The prisoners were paired with ranch hands who worked like metronomes. Steady, patient, exact. No one was allowed to drift. A boy from Szeged named Andor learned to oil a saddle and carry it without banging his shins. A mason from Győr found his hands knew fences before his mind did. When he cinched a wire too tight and it sang like a blade, the cowboy beside him tapped the post with his hammer and said, "Easy, easy," and the wire settled. What kind of captor corrects a mistake with a whisper? The prisoners wondered. What kind of nation treats an enemy like a hired man who needs showing, not scolding? At noon, they ate in the shade of a windmill. Beef stew again, this time with carrots. Thick slices of bread. And then the bottles returned. The glass caps pinged, and the hiss rose like a snake. Some of the men laughed when the bubbles burned their throats, a laughing half born of pain, half born of joy. Andor swore he could feel the sugar hit his blood and light his bones. He looked toward the house and saw the woman in the apron leaning against the doorframe, watching them as if they were not stray dogs nor circus animals, but men swept into her yard by a storm she had not ordered and would not waste time hating. The afternoon brought the small humiliations work always brings, which is to say, the necessary lessons. A dropped pail. A horse stepped sideways and pinned a boot. A rope caught around a shin. The Texans cursed lightly and showed how to avoid the mistake next time. When a guard did speak sharply, it was because a gate had been left unlatched and the herd had turned a direction that required half an hour to fix. The rifles remained on shoulders. The sun did the punishing. By the time the shadow of the barn stretched long, the prisoners had earned a fatigue that felt honest. That night, a guitar appeared. It was battered to wood in places, frets shining like old coins. Walt strummed a tune about the river and the road. A German prisoner hummed without words. Then Lajos, who had never played, tried a few clumsy chords and made the men laugh and clap. The boundary that had stood so tall at dawn seemed by moonrise to have sunk knee-high. It did not mean anyone forgot the war. It meant that for an hour there were only men and a song and a sky so wide it could hold everything. The strangest part came later, when invitations began to slip across the line like notes. "Come by the house on Sunday," one read, written in a careful hand, and carried by a guard who looked embarrassed to be the messenger of something gentle. The men assumed another test, but on Sunday they were walked to the porch and shown seats at the table and asked if they wanted more chicken and whether the pickles were too sharp for their taste. A child peered from behind the door with a toy horse crushed in his fist and was shooed forward to say hello. The prisoners raised their hands in greeting, palms open, the universal sign that a man has nothing hidden. For a few minutes they forgot how far they were from home. The house smelled of soap and warm flour, and a scent they could not name that seemed to mean plenty. Pictures on the wall showed weddings and a man in a uniform that did not match any army they knew. When they left, one of the cowboys pressed a small paper sack into Andor's hands. In it was a slice of pie wrapped in a clean rag. "Do not show the sergeant," the cowboy said with a wink, and everyone laughed, including the sergeant. Back in the barracks, the men shared crumbs with a quiet reverence. By the end of the week, their steps had changed. Shoulders that had been braced for blows loosened. They still kept their pride, but it stood now beside something new. Curiosity. They asked the names of tools. They practiced the words for saddle and river and Friday. They discovered that the cows moved better when a man sang under his breath. They discovered that a hat could be a shield and a permission. They discovered that the hardest thing to bear after fear is welcome. Progress note and quick tweak suggestions for virality. Opening confirms title and sets dissonance well. If you want an even sharper hook, we can add a single, vivid micro-image in the first sentence, like the pop of a bottle cap, to jolt the ear. Midway, the projector scene plants curiosity about American myth. We can tighten one paragraph by trimming the list of foods to keep pacing brisk during the first meal beat. On the second Sunday, a different note entered the tune. A pickup rolled into the yard with a block of ice wrapped in burlap. The driver lifted it with tongs and set it on a table. The prisoners crowded closer, breath fogging the cold like boys at a fair. The rancher shaved curls with a handsaw, and the woman in the apron scooped the glitter into cups. Condensed milk, a spoon of sugar, a drop of vanilla. She stirred, and the mixture turned to snow under her hands. When she passed the cups out, Lajos held his like a relic. He had never tasted anything a man could call cold and soft at the same time. He took a spoonful and closed his eyes as if listening for a sound. The cowboys watched, smiling at the silence that fell. That afternoon, a traveling Red Cross man set up at a desk by the barn and told them they could write home. The paper felt like a sheet of light. The rule was strict, 1 page only. No details that could help an enemy army. But what could a son write in such a space when the world had tilted? Lajos began "Dear Mother" and stared at the next line until the ink dried at the nib. "I am alive," he finally wrote. "I am working on a ranch. I am being fed." He wanted to say that he had eaten ice cream made in a yard under an open sky that went on forever. He wanted to say that the strangest part of captivity is the way it hands you back your appetite. He settled for "I am well, and please do not worry," and gave the letter to the man who stamped it, neat and official. The next week brought wind like a fist. The sky blackened at noon, and the smell of rain arrived before the first drop. Cowboys waved the men toward the barns and closed doors against the gusts. The storm hit like a train. The roof drummed. Dust turned to mud in a blink. A bolt of lightning climbed the night that had fallen at lunchtime, and every man flinched. By dusk, the storm passed and left the air scrubbed clean. The ranch hands strung lanterns and checked the herd. A calf had slipped into a wash. Walt called for a rope, and 2 prisoners ran beside him without thinking. They braced, leaned back, and hauled while Walt climbed down and pushed from below. The calf came up bawling and tried to run, but its legs wobbled. Walt rubbed its neck and said, "There you go, like a prayer." That night no one spoke about enemies. They spoke about the storm. The words for wind and river and mud tumbled between languages until they meant the same thing. A guitar came out again, and the German prisoner sang a song about mountains and bread. Walt followed with a tune about a road that keeps going whether you like it or not. Andor tried a song from home, rough but proud, and the men clapped in time even when they could not find the melody. Music found the theme that orders and speeches never reach. The house became a regular stop on Sundays and sometimes Wednesdays if the work had gone well and the weather had not misbehaved. Inside the parlor, a radio sat like a polished black stone. The woman turned the dial with 2 fingers, and voices rose from oceans away, news, baseball, a preacher whose words rolled like wagon wheels over gravel. The prisoners stood quiet at first, listening to a world that still seemed impossible. Then questions came. What city is that? How far is St. Louis? Is there snow there now? The woman answered what she could and laughed when the men asked if the baseball players truly earned money to run in circles and swing at air. One evening, the rancher brought out a bundle of newspaper clippings tied with string. He laid them on the table and tapped a headline about a bridge built in a single week by soldiers who needed it. He pointed at photographs of ships stacked on a beach like buildings. The prisoners bent close. They measured with their eyes. They compared to the river bridges back home and the slow trains that had brought them to war. The rancher did not explain. He did not need to. The pictures were sentences a man reads with his gut. Hard work settled into the bones the way a melody eventually does. The men woke with the sun and tied their boots without waiting to be told. They learned that a gate chain must be hung, not dropped, or it will tangle a horse at dusk. They learned that a quiet voice moves a herd faster than shouting. They learned the smell of coming rain and the sound of a lame hoof. In the evenings, they traded words. Hat became kalap, river became folio, Friday became pentek. The ranch hands tried the new sounds and laughed at their own clumsiness. The prisoners returned the laughter with a grace that surprised them. There were moments that still bit. A guard who had lost a cousin at the front spoke too hard some days, and then came back at dusk to apologize under his breath. A letter arrived with a red stamp and no contents. A man went quiet for a week. Meals that had once seemed unimaginable now carried the echo of a table far away where a mother might be eating boiled potatoes without salt. Abundance is not cruel, but it can throw a shadow that follows a man to bed. The cowboys understood without words, and sometimes left a plate on the porch of the barracks wrapped in cloth, without a note. Toward the end of summer, a county fair opened in town. There was talk of bringing the prisoners to the edge of the grounds, under a guard, so they could watch the rodeo. The idea sounded like a trick until the trucks came clean and early and the guards climbed in like men on a Sunday, not soldiers on a raid. The prisoners rode with their hats brim low and eyes wide. The fair smelled of sugar and diesel and hay. The rodeo announcer spoke fast and bright into a microphone, and the crowd answered with a river of noise. A bronc exploded from a chute, and a rider stuck to the saddle like a truth, and then fell and bounced and waved with both hands to show he was whole. The prisoners laughed and winced with everyone else. When a boy barely taller than a fence post wrestled a calf to the ground, Andor slapped his own knee and shouted a word that needed no translation. On the way back, the truck stopped at a stand where a boy sold bottles from a tub of ice. The guards bought a round and passed the bottles down. Caps pinged into the dirt. The sun threw coins on the truck beds. For a moment, The world narrowed to the fizz and the swallow, and the small relief of sweetness. Lajos looked out over the fields and felt something move inside him that was not surrender and not defiance. It was the sense that a life could be built like a fence, post by post, with patience, with decent food in the evening, and a tune to carry a man to sleep. News drifted from Europe like smoke. The maps in the newspapers shifted. Cities changed hands. Armies gave ground. There was a day when the rancher did not come to the porch at supper, and the woman folded and unfolded a towel, and finally said the word, "Hospital." The prisoners kept their voices low at the table. The next morning the rancher returned, and raised a hand to show all was well. Men nodded, and felt the relief in their shoulders the way you feel a heavy bucket set down. One afternoon, Walt set up a sawhorse and laid a coil of rope on the ground. He drew a chalk circle in the dust and grinned. Anyone who could drop the loop over the horn in 2 tries would win a prize. The prize turned out to be a pair of socks, so soft, Andor folded them against his cheek. Men missed and laughed and missed again, and then learned to keep the wrist loose and the arm quiet, and to feel the weight of the rope rather than wrestle it. When Lajos caught the horn on his second try, he looked for the trick in his own hands and found none. There was only attention and practice, and someone patient enough to show him twice. As the months turned, the prisoners began to tell their own stories out loud. Not speeches, not confessions, just stories about fishing and brickwork and a river bend near a town that smelled of apples in the fall. The cowboys listened like men listen when they are mending a saddle and not in a hurry. They answered with stories about cattle lost and found, a sister married on a cold morning when the breath of the horses turned white, a father who could fix anything with wire and patience. The words braided themselves into something stout. One night after chores, the woman brought out a sewing basket and held up a torn shirt. She threaded a needle and began to stitch, teaching by showing. A line of men watched, then laughed, then took the needle themselves. Pride sat on the rail and swung its legs and decided it could live with this lesson. A man who can sew his own shirt is a man who will not be caught bare. The next day, several prisoners mended sleeves at lunch without comment, as natural as sharpening a knife. A chaplain from town visited once a month. He was a small man with a voice that sounded like a creak over stones. He did not preach as much as talk. He said that mercy is not an argument but a practice. He asked whether anyone wanted to write another letter. He left behind a small stack of paper and a tin of pencils that seemed endless. He shook every hand before he left and did not squeeze harder than necessary. When men returned to their bunks, they found the room somehow larger, and then a letter came back for Lajos. It had traveled for months through offices and rail cars and rooms that smelled of gum and ink. It carried the thin paper voice of his mother. "I am alive," she wrote. "I dream of your hands around a warm cup." He read the words 3 times and then looked at his own hands, calloused now, and at the cup of coffee on the table, and the room tilted again. He raised the cup to the door where the evening light stood and drank, a toast to a kitchen across an ocean. Progress note and quick tweak suggestions for virality. The storm and rescue sequence adds stakes without violence and deepens the bond. If you want an extra jolt early in this block, we can open with the ice shaving image as a single sentence paragraph to spike retention. Consider trimming 1 rodeo sentence to keep momentum snapping during that scene. When the war finally ended, the news arrived not with fanfare, but with a whisper. A guard walked to the edge of the yard and said quietly, "It's over." The sky was the same. The cattle still moved across the fields, but every man felt something invisible loosen around his chest. The prisoners stood uncertain. not sure whether to cheer or bow their heads. Walt took off his hat, the rancher followed, and soon everyone stood bareheaded in the sunlight. No speeches, no orders, just the long, steady sound of wind over the grass. In the weeks that followed, preparations began to send the men home. New clothes were issued, plain but clean. The prisoners helped paint fences, fixed wagons, stacked hay, as if tidying their own memories before leaving them behind. On the last Sunday, the rancher invited them all to the house again. The table in the yard was crowded with every bit of food the family could spare: chicken, bread, corn, slices of watermelon, and bottles of Coca Cola sweating in the heat. The woman poured coffee and wiped her eyes with the edge of her apron. Lajos tried to find the words to thank them, but the right ones didn't exist in any language he knew. So he raised his bottle. "To Texas," he said, his accent thick, and the rancher clinked glass against glass. The sound was small but clear as a bell. Around them, men who had once been soldiers of an enemy army laughed softly and drank, the fizz rising like applause. When the trucks came, no one hurried. The prisoners shook hands with the guards who had once carried rifles on them. Walt handed Lajos the hat he had worn all summer. "Keep it," he said. "Shade follows a man better than pride." Lajos nodded, the brim trembling in his hands. He wanted to say that this place had rebuilt something inside him that the war had broken, but he only said thank you and climbed aboard. As the convoy rolled down the dirt road, the ranchers waved until the dust swallowed them. In the trucks, no one spoke for a long time. Then Andor murmured, "Do you think they will remember us?" Lajos looked at the hat in his lap, at the sweat-stained band, at the smell of leather and sun. "I hope so," he said. "I think we will remember them." Years later, when he told the story to his children, he would speak not of battlefields or commands, but of that first bottle of Coca Cola, of the way cold sweetness could erase a year of fear, of the cowboy who taught him how to throw a rope without anger, of a family who fed their enemies because it was the decent thing to do. He would say that America's strength was not cruelty or arrogance, but the calm confidence of people who believed they had more than enough food, enough land, enough kindness to spare. In the memory of those Hungarian prisoners, Texas was never just a place of dust and cattle. It was a classroom where they learned that power could wear a smile, that mercy could be as sharp as any weapon, and that generosity, once witnessed, is impossible to forget. They returned home carrying the taste of Coca Cola and the image of wide skies, reminders that even in defeat, a man can discover a new kind of freedom, the freedom to see the world as larger than his orders. History remembers the wars by the dates and the dead, but the truer victories are quieter. They happen in the moments when enemies share a meal, when fear gives way to curiosity, when a cowboy passes a hat across a fence line and says, "Here, you'll need this more than I will. If this story moved you, share it." Somewhere out there, someone still believes kindness is weakness. Remind them that once, on a Texas ranch, mercy was stronger than war,